Hi everybody, today I'm going to teach you lesson 13-4, types of statistical studies. So there are two main types of statistical studies. The first type we're going to talk about today is what's called an observational study. And an observational study sounds just like the word that's in it, observe, right? So in an observational study, you're observing a sample population and you're recording some information or some data about that population. The important thing to remember is you're just observing subjects, but you're not manipulating any variables. So for example, if I wanted to research the link between using cell phones and brain cancer, I could watch to see how long people use their cell phones each day and then record the number of hours that they used it, and then also record after a certain period of time whether the person developed brain cancer or not. Okay. This was an observational study because there was no attempt to influence the people's cell phone usage. The downside with an observational study, so watching these people use their cell phones, recording how long they were on their phone, and then also recording whether they develop brain cancer or not, is that there's no cause and effect conclusion that can be drawn. So you can't say if you use your cell phone for X amount of hours, then you develop brain cancer. What you can say, though, is that if you use your cell phone for X amount of hours, you may be more likely to develop brain cancer. Okay, so in an observational study, you can claim there's an association or a link between two things, but not a causation. So there's no cause and effect conclusion. Okay. So observational study, you're observing and you're not manipulating any variables. You're just observing, recording, and then drawing a conclusion about what you observed. But it can't be a cause and effect conclusion. Okay. So one way to conduct an observational study is to use a survey. So surveys are used to gather data for the observational study. Okay, and usually when we create a survey, we pick a sample group to learn about the entire population. So it would be impossible to survey every single person, let's say in Jericho High School, if we wanted to know the percentage of kids that brought lunch from home. But what we could do is we could create a sample group. And our hopes would be that if we create a good sample group, we'd be able to generalize our results to the entire population. So if we surveyed, let's say, every 10th person that came in the door at Jericho High School one morning, and we asked them whether they brought lunch from home or whether they were buying, and we did this for a few weeks, every day we sampled every 10th person that came in, then we could draw a conclusion based upon that data. Because we took a sample group, every 10th person, from the entire population, and we did it in a way that was random. So when you create a survey that you're using to gather data from an observational study, you want to make sure that you're randomly selecting people for your survey. So ideally, participants would be randomly selected from the population of interest. Okay. If you're not randomly selecting people for your survey, then you can draw misleading conclusions from the survey that wouldn't necessarily be true. Okay. Another thing you want to keep in mind when you are creating a survey is that you want to come up with questions that are good questions. Okay. So a question that's not so good is what kind of computer do you own? Because they're asking you to circle one or the other. You might not have either of those types of computers. And they also don't have a choice for saying you have no computer. So a better question would be, do you own a computer? Yes or no? And if you answered yes, what type of computer is it? I want to jump down here to what's called bias. Oops. Okay. So when you're designing a survey that creates responses that differ from how the population would respond, this is called a biased survey. So you have to be careful. The easiest way to describe this to you, I think, is through an example. So if you looked at this example down here, a survey is being conducted to determine if the cable company should add another sports channel to their schedule. We want to know which survey would have the least biased. So least biased would mean that it's the most true or most indicative of how the entire population would respond. So if I'm talking about adding another sports channel to a schedule, if I surveyed men at the gym, chances are if you're a man who's at the gym, you are more likely to watch sports because more physically fit men tend to be very interested in sports. Okay. Let's take a look at choice 3. So if I surveyed 50 fans at a soccer game, chances are if you're a fan at a soccer game, you're interested in sports as well. And if I looked at choice 4, if I surveyed 20 members of the high school football team, if you're on the football team, chances are you like to watch sports on TV. So the best choice here that would indicate the least biased would be if I created a survey and I gave it to 45 people at a mall. Because if you're going to a mall, you're not necessarily interested in sports. So you want to make sure that when you're creating your survey and when you're giving your survey to your random sample of people, that you're sampling people in the least biased way. So the most random type of sample that you could come up with. Okay, so let's take a look at the second type of study that we're going to talk about today, which is an experimental study. So if you're talking about an experimental study imposes a treatment to see if the treatment works or it doesn't work. So in an experimental study, there are 2 things you have to remember. The first is random assignment. So what that means is you're going to take your sample of people that you're going to study and you're going to assign them to 2 groups, a control group and a treatment group. They're going to be assigned randomly to either one of those groups. So, for example, if I had 20 students, I could put all 20 names in a hat and I could randomly pick out 10 to be in the control group and 10 to be in the treatment group. In the control group, nothing is changed. In the treatment group, they're given some type of treatment and then we measure the response. So for example, if you look at the second example in this paragraph, suppose I want to compare the effects of 2 weed killers on pansies. So I have 24 plants. So I'm going to randomly assign my plants to either the control group, 12 to the control group, and 12 to the treatment group. Okay. In the control group, I'm not putting anything on my plants. In the treatment group, I'm putting weed killer A on my plants. And then after a certain amount of time, I'm going to measure my plants, see how healthy they are, how tall they are, whatever you're trying to focus your experiment on. Okay, so let's say I have my two groups. I have my group in weed killer A that got the pansies in group A that got weed killer A, and then I have the pansies in group B that didn't have anything applied to them. And at the end of my study, I noticed that the pansies in group A are dead and the pansies in group B are alive. I can make a cause and effect statement. So I can say, due to applying weed killer A to pansies in the treatment group, they died. Whereas pansies in the control group lived. So in an experimental study, you can draw a cause and effect conclusion. Okay. So let's take a look at the Regents example. Describe how a controlled experiment can be created to examine the effect of ingredient X in a toothpaste. So whenever you're creating an experiment, we talked about earlier that you had to randomly assign the participants to two groups. Okay. You also had to create, once you made those two groups, you had to create one group that receives the treatment, which in this case is toothpaste with ingredient X, and the other group that doesn't receive the treatment. So in their toothpaste, there's no ingredient X. So let's just do a little summary before we continue. So we talked about observational studies. No, let me use a different color for the summary. And we talked about experimental studies. In an observational study, you just observe. There's no manipulation of variables. And you can only draw associations, no cause effect conclusions. You can say something is likely to happen based upon your observational study or not likely to happen based upon your observational study, but you can't say that it's going to happen or not happen based upon your observational study. Okay? And one way to conduct an observational study is by using a survey. Oops. Okay. In an experimental study, you're creating an experiment. So you have a control group and a treatment group. And you always, when you create your experiment, you need to have random assignment of people to each group. If you don't have random assignment, you can create bias, meaning that your experiment wouldn't produce results that are necessarily true or indicative of the entire population. So what I'd like you to do now is to answer the 10 practice questions and then to submit them for today. Thanks very much, guys. Have a good day.